And welcome again to Cottage Talk. I am Russ Goldman. This is the player ratings show. This is one that I am bringing back. I talked about we were going to be doing a bunch of shows. Well, I'm bringing this one back. It's been several years. I used to do this with Ryan O'Donovan. Well, I've decided to bring the show back, and we're going to test drive it back. I have the player ratings from Dan Crawford from HammyN.com. I'm going to share his player ratings. I might also share some ratings from WhoScored.com on this match. We'll talk about the player's performance in this show. I plan on doing a player rating show each and every week as well. But I thought, hey, why not try it in this FA Cup victory for Fulham? I know it's the third show talking about this Hull City victory, but I say, why not? Told you I was going to give you a lot of content. I'm going to have it keep coming to you. So here we go, talking about the players' performances. And if you have a rating for these players, you're watching live, feel free to share some comments. I'd be happy to share them on the show. So before we get going, I want to always mention, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters and supporters of other clubs find us. So please do that. Okay. So what I decided to do, unfortunately, Dan Crawford could not join me tonight because I was going to have him on to go through his player ratings, but I am still going to go through his ratings, and I'm going to share my thoughts on what Dan shared, and that's basically going to be the show. We're going to talk about the performances, and then we're going to move on because we have a lot of shows coming up. I have Transfer Tuesday on Tuesday, tomorrow. Wednesday, we have our Chelsea preview. Thursday, we have the return of the Fulham Shadow and also my friend Steve Reynolds as we do another Cottage Talk full-time show after the Chelsea match. A lot of content coming your way. So, but let's get going. Let's talk about the player ratings for this match from Dan Crawford. Let's start at the top. Marek Rodak. Now, Dan gave him a 9. And on WhoScored.com, they actually gave the goalkeeper a 7.4. And as anyone knows about the player ratings, they're usually around 7 or 6. They're usually somewhere around that on WhoScored.com. So I'm not surprised by these ratings. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to share a part of Dan's article. And we're going to get a little thoughts of what Dan gave Marek Rodak that rating. So this is what Dan had to share. The Slovakian international goalkeeper has once again been passed over for Premier League duties, having helped the Whites win promotion for a second time. Here were the visitors under the cosh for much of the first 20 minutes, and the closing 20 minutes, he made a series of superb saves to keep a clean sheet that will have reminded Silva that he's still a top quality goalkeeper at his disposal, as well with Bernd Leno. He did well to keep out a drive from Louis Coyle, made 2 brilliant stops to deny substitutes Aaron Connolly and Oscar Estupiñán. Now, I know I said that wrong, but anyways, Dan's rating, a 9. I tend to agree with it because that actually is my man of the match. Marek Rodak is my man of the match. So that's why I'm agreeing with it. I'm going with a 9. Okay. So let's move on to Bobby Decordova-Reid. And Dan gives him a 6, and I'm actually in full agreement on this. This is what Dan had to share about Bobby Decordova-Reid. Fulham's utility man celebrated his contract extension with another outing at right back. He offered plenty of drive going forward in the first half, but a couple of defensive lapses almost allowed Hull City to take the lead. Decordova-Reid failed to deal with the routine forward ball, allowing Harvey Vale to run in on goal, and that presented the ball to Ryan Woods in a dangerous position. You couldn't fault his commitment, but it was no surprise that Silva turned to Kenny Tete to try and shore things up. Okay. And on WhoScored.com, Bobby Decordova-Reid got a 6.3. I'm actually going to agree completely with Dan. I'm going to give him a 6. I think we might be a little generous here, but I'm going to say a 6 for Bobby Decordova-Reid. Okay, let's move on. Let's go to Levin Kurzawa. Now, Dan gives an 8. And here's what he had to share. The French fullback's Fulham career has been stop-start affair since he aggravated a calf problem during his debut against Newcastle on his debut and had to be taken off at halftime. Here, we saw why the Whites were keen to bring Kurzawa in on loan from PSG. Nobody would have him down as a goal scorer, but he poached an excellent opener after Matt Ingram had parried Harry Wilson's shot. He drove forward with purpose along the left flank and whipped in a number of dangerous crosses. 8. So Kurzawa gets an 8. And also, WhoScored.com gave him a 7.8, and he was their man of the match. So just want to mention that. I'm going to go lower there. I'm going to give Layvin Kurzawa a 7 because I thought his play in the first half was, again, a mixed bag. I still think it was a mixed bag. I thought his positioning was not great. I'm going to go with a 7. I might even go a little bit lower, but I think I'm going to go with a 7. He's not my man of the match. So let's move on to talk about the center back. And we were talking about this on the post-match show. Tosin Adarabioyo gets a 6, and Issa Diop gets a 6, both from Dan. And to be honest with you, I agree with that. I don't think that they were spectacular at all. I thought they were okay. They deserve a 6. And the Who Scored rating actually had Diop at a 7.0 and Adarabioyo at 7.1. I think they're being generous here. I'm going to go with Dan, and I'm going to give them both a 6. I thought they were okay, but not great. I expect better from these players. Okay, let's move on to Harrison Reed. Now, Dan gives Harrison Reed a 6. And this is what Dan had to share about Harrison Reed. It took a while for Fulham's passing football to get going, and that was largely down to Hull's tenaciousness in the tackle and their own desire. Reed produced another all-action performance, but was something of a red-adair in the engine room during the first half. He scrapped for all he was worth, as ever, but the revelation of the season, productivity in the final third, was largely absent here. 6. Dan, I'm going to go a little bit lower. I'm going to give him a 5.5. Harrison Reed on WhoScored.com gets a 6.8. I thought he was non-existent in this match, but I understand why you went with a 6. I'm going to go a little bit lower. Disagreeing with you a little bit, Dan, on that. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about Tom Kearney. It's funny because I thought we should have talked a little bit more about Tom Kearney on the post-match show. That's on me because I thought Tom Kearney was more than solid in this match. And Dan's rating of a 7 is interesting. I'm going to read what he had to share about the Fulham captain. The captain crafted another classy showing on his return to the club that gave him a shot at professional football after Leeds left him heartbroken. Kearney won tackles, dictated play, and gradually ran the game from a deep-lying midfield position. Dan gives him a 7. WhoScored.com gives Tom Kearney a 7.2. I'm going to go a little bit higher. I'm going to give Tom Kearney a 7.5. I thought he was more than solid. I just want to go a little bit above the ratings from WhoScored.com, and then, of course, Dan Crawford. Let's now go to Dan James. And I've seen a lot of good comments about Dan James. Let's see what Dan Crawford had to share about Dan James. During the first half, you felt the Welsh winger was trying too hard to make an impression after an error strewn across against Southampton on New Year's Eve. But James worked both with the ball and committing defenders and embarking on powerful runs and without it, keeping Hull's defenders honest as they sought to find an equalizer, was vital in Fulham's success. His pace is a major asset, as shown by the way he streaked away from the remnants of Hull's defense in stoppage time to steal Fulham's spot in the fourth round. And James definitely makes the squad stronger. 7. So obviously, Dan Crawford likes what he saw from Dan James and believes in Dan James. It's pretty obvious he believes in Dan James. The WhoScored.com rating for Dan James, 7.6. Pretty good. pretty good. I'm going to go with a 7. I'm going to go with Dan on that. I could go a little bit lower. I don't think he was as good as Dan suggested, but he scored the goal. That's why I'm going to give him a 7. Again, at times, it's all about his pace, but his potential can lead to what we hope he will be, which is a complete player. He's not the finished article, and he keeps showing that. But he just dangles that potential in front of you, and we saw it in this match. Okay, let's go on to Harry Wilson. And Dan Crawford, 6. And he said Wilson has yet to hit the heights of his outstanding first campaign at Craven Cottage. In some respects, that is understandable. The winger was crudely taken out of a preseason friendly by Tyrone Mings, and his return to first-team football felt fast-tracked with Wales' first World Cup since 1958 on the horizon. Wilson got pelters for missing a glorious chance at death against Leicester in midweek, but worked exceptionally hard here. It still isn't quite flowing for him, but he never hid and created the first goal with a trademark curler. 6 for Dan. I'm going to agree with Dan on a 6 because that was a great assist. So that was a very good assist. WhoScored.com gives him a 6.7. So they're a little bit above Dan and myself. Okay, let's move on. Andres Pereira. Let's talk about Andres Pereira. And he gets a 6. And this is not vintage Pereira for me. And I think Dan's going to agree with that. I'm actually going to go a little bit lower. I'm going to say 5.5. Dan gives him a 6. The Brazilian buzzed around behind his compatriot Carlos Vinicius and was involved in Fulham's best moves, but he probably should have scored the 2 chances that came his way in the first period. His shot from inside the box was a little too close to Matt Ingram, and although he did get close a couple of minutes later with an effort that whizzed past the far post, the attacking midfielder had the time to hit the target after brilliant approach work from James and Kearney. He gives them 6. I'm going a little bit lower on that. And I think maybe it has more to do with me, with my expectations for him. I expect better. He did have some opportunities, but I expect better from him. WhoScored.com gives him a 6.3. Okay, now let's go on to the striker, and this is going to be an interesting one. So Dan gives Carlos Vinicius a 6. And I'm going to agree with Dan on this. I'm going with a 6. I don't think he's great with balls at his feet. And I think that's a problem for Vinicius. I want crosses in the box to Carlos Vinicius, and I hope we see that in the Chelsea match. I still believe in him. We still need to see more. This is what Dan had to share. There was plenty to like about the Brazilian's performance. He was up for the physical battle and held the ball up, but he faded when the Whites needed a focal point up front. So Dan gives him a 6, and I tend to agree with that. WhoScored.com gives him a 6.5. Not bad. Not bad. Just not great. And hopefully we'll see more with better service from Carlos Vinicius. I still believe in him. I think he can be your backup striker, but I agree with Dan on his ratings. Okay. Finish this up. We're going to talk about the substitutes in our player rating show. Okay. So to finish up the show, I'm just going to really just read the ratings for the substitutes, and we'll just go through that, and then I'll talk about one player to end the show. So Dan gives Kenny Tete a 7. He gives João Paulina a 7. He gives Anthony Robinson a 6. Nathaniel Chalobah is barely on, gives him a 6. But I want to focus on our last commentary on Manor Solomon, because I think this player is going to be an impact player for Fulham. So I want to end with Dan's thoughts on Manor Solomon. So this is what Dan had to share. Manor Solomon, the Israeli's encouraging cameo, was arguably one of the highlights of the day. He was diligent, defensively offering cover to Tete in the right back position, and looked lively going forward. The highlight was a sensational bit of skill that beat his man down by the touchline and a speedy run that took Solomon to the edge of the area with the home defense in full retreat. Dan gives him a 7. I'm going to agree with him. I think 7's the right rating. I'm going to go with Dan, and I'm going to say a 7. And I think it's very encouraging what you saw from Manor Solomon, extremely. And let's hope that this is just the beginning for Manor Solomon. I hope so, but only time will tell. Okay. Well, that's going to do it for this first episode, comeback episode of the Player Rating Show. I will have co-hosts on there doing player ratings, but I wanted to get some more content out for you. And I don't expect everyone to watch and listen to everything. We will have full-length shows, and we'll have what I would call a mini show where we can talk about a certain subject, in this case, the ratings, and go through it. As I mentioned, we have a lot of content coming from you all this week, and the numbers of people watching Cottage Talk have been phenomenal. So I once again want to say thank you for watching and listening to Cottage Talk. Lastly, before we go, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. Okay. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Player Rating Show. I'm Russ Goldman. Thank you as always for watching and listening to Cottage Talk, now part of the talkSPORT Fan Network.